The winter air was merciless, slicing through the trees like icy knives. Snow blanketed the ground in thick layers, muffling every sound except for the crunch of Alara's boots as she hiked through the dense forest. This trail had always been her escape, a place where she could find solace away from the world's clamor. But today something felt off. The air was still too still. The usual rustling of small animals and chirping of birds had vanished. A creeping unease settled in her chest as she pulled her coat tighter around her body. She trudged forward, her breath visible in the frosty air, when something caught her eye. A dark figure stood motionless among the trees, barely visible against the thick white backdrop. At first, she thought it was a fallen tree or a mound of snow-covered debris, but something about it was unsettling. It wasn't just an object, it had shape, presence, weight. Her pulse quickened. Was it an animal? Person? The deeper she stared, the more fear settled in her gut. Cautiously, she stepped closer, her heart pounding as the image became clearer. It was an animal, a bear, but something was horribly wrong. Its body slumped against the trunk of a tree, its fur stiff with frost, its limbs barely moving. The sight sent a chill down her spine, colder than the winter wind whipping around her. She hesitated, questioning whether she was truly seeing what she thought. Bears were strong creatures, built to endure even the harshest winters. Yet this one looked helpless. Then she saw it. Thick, rusted chains wrapped tightly around its body, binding it to the tree. The metal dug into the bear's fur, restricting its movement. A lump formed in Alara's throat. Someone had done this. Someone had left this bear to die here, abandoned and defenseless. The cruelty of it was sickening. Her chest tightened with rage and sorrow as she took another cautious step forward. The bear's breathing was faint, shallow. Its eyes, half-lidded and clouded with exhaustion, barely flickered in recognition of her presence. It had been here too long, suffering in the unbearable cold. Snow had piled up around its legs, nearly burying it where it sat. Ice clung to its fur like a deathly embrace. Alara knew the signs of hypothermia, and this bear was in its final stages. If she didn't act fast, it wouldn't last much longer. Her mind raced. What could she do? She had no tools, no way to break the chains. Instinctively, she reached out, her fingers grazing the icy metal. It was solid, unyielding. Her hands were already numb from the cold, but she didn't care. She had to find a way to free the bear. Glancing around, she searched for any sign of who might have done this, but the forest was eerily empty, the silence pressing in on her like a warning. Whoever had tied the bear here was long gone, or worse, watching from the shadows. The thought made her shiver, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't focus on fear right now. She pulled off her gloves and carefully pressed a hand against the bear's fur. It was ice cold, its body barely generating warmth. The poor thing had lost its will to fight, its strength drained by the freezing temperatures. Alara felt a surge of desperation. She couldn't just leave it here. Her breath came faster as she knelt beside the bear, her mind working frantically. If she could warm it up, keep it alive just a little longer, maybe she could find help. But out here, in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no one around for miles, she knew one thing for certain. She was on her own, and time was running out. Alara's heart pounded against her ribs as she crouched beside the bear. Its body was still, save for the faint rise and fall of its chest, barely perceptible beneath the thick, ice-crusted fur. She placed a hesitant hand against its side, feeling the weak, slow rhythm of its breathing. It was alive, but only just. The cruel chains wrapped around its body dug into its flesh, restricting movement and likely cutting off circulation. She winced at the sight, fury and helplessness colliding in her mind. How long had this bear been here? Days? Hours? However long, it was too much. She scanned the area for anything that could help, but the forest was nothing more than an expanse of endless white and skeletal trees. The nearest town was miles away, and with the thickening snowfall, it would be impossible to make the trek quickly. Her fingers dug into her coat pockets, searching for anything. Her phone, a pocket knife, even a piece of cloth to insulate the bear's body. But she had come unprepared, expecting only a quiet hike, not a life-or-death situation. She had no choice. She had to act with what little she had. Elara unzipped her thick jacket and shrugged it off, ignoring the immediate bite of cold against her arms. She hesitated only for a second before draping it over the bear, tucking it as best she could around its shivering frame. It wasn't much, but it was something, maybe just enough to slow the bear's descent into unconsciousness. Next, she turned her attention to the chain. She gripped it with both hands and pulled, testing its strength. It didn't budge. The links were thick, rusted but sturdy, and locked with an ancient-looking padlock. Even if she had a key, she doubted it would work in this weather. Frustration bubbled in her chest. She yanked harder, but the metal barely shifted. The bear stirred, a weak groan escaping its throat. Elara stilled, watching as its eyes cracked open. Two dark, glassy orbs barely registering her presence. It was too weak to react, too drained to be afraid. She could see it in its dull gaze. Resignation, the quiet acceptance of death. "No," she muttered under her breath, determination flaring inside her. Not today. Her mind raced. She needed something to cut through the chain, but there was nothing nearby. Then a memory surfaced. An old hunting cabin, abandoned and forgotten, just a half-mile north. She had passed it countless times during her hikes. If it was still standing, there was a chance, however small, that it had tools inside. The risk was enormous. Leaving the bear alone, even for a short while, meant gambling with its life. If the cold didn't claim it, some other predator might. But what choice did she have? She couldn't break the chain with her bare hands, and staying here helpless wasn't an option. She exhaled sharply and looked at the bear. "Stay with me," she whispered, even though she knew it wouldn't understand. Standing, she took one last glance around the forest, making sure no one was lurking nearby. The eerie silence remained. Elara turned and sprinted, her boots kicking up powdery snow as she made her way toward the old cabin. The run felt longer than it should have, her legs pushing through the thick snow, her breath ragged from the biting cold. The landscape blurred into endless white until, finally, the dark outline of the cabin came into view. It was small, barely more than a wooden shack, but it still stood. She reached the door and shoved against it, the wood groaning before giving way. Dust and stale air filled her lungs as she stepped inside, eyes darting frantically across the dim interior. Broken furniture, old hunting gear, and scattered debris littered the space. Then, in the corner, she saw it. An old axe, rusted but sturdy, its wooden handle weathered by time. Nearby, a pair of wire cutters sat atop a forgotten workbench, dull but intact. Her fingers curled around both, her mind racing. This had to be enough. She wasted no time. Gripping the tools, she bolted back outside, her pulse hammering. The snow had thickened, falling in heavy flakes, obscuring her vision as she forced herself to move faster. The wind howled, a sharp reminder of how quickly the storm was worsening. When she finally reached the spot where she had left the bear, her heart nearly stopped. There in the snow were footprints, fresh ones, and they weren't hers. Elara froze, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the ground. The prints were deep, crisp, and unmistakably human. Someone had been here while she was gone. Her heart pounded in her ears as she followed the tracks with her eyes, leading toward the very spot where the bear was tied. Her hands clenched around the axe and wire cutters as a wave of panic surged through her. Was the person still nearby? Had they returned to check on the bear, or worse, to finish what they started? The thought made her stomach twist. Taking slow, measured steps, she moved forward, every nerve in her body on high alert. The snowfall made visibility difficult, but as she drew closer, she saw the bear still slumped against the tree. Relief flooded through her. It was still there, but something was off. The fresh snow around the bear was disturbed, as if someone had walked right up to it. But there were no signs of a struggle, no new chains, no injuries. Just those silent footprints leading away into the forest. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crawled down Elara's spine. Whoever had come here had left without harming the bear. But why? Had they seen her approaching and fled? Had they changed their mind? Or were they simply watching, waiting? She shook off the fear. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was getting the bear free now. Dropping to her knees, she yanked off her gloves and grabbed the wire cutters. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, but she forced them to move, positioning the cutters around the first link of the chain. She squeezed with all her strength, but the metal barely dented. Gritting her teeth, she tried again. The rusted steel groaned, bending slightly, but still held strong. Time was slipping away, she could feel it. The bear's breathing was even weaker now, its body unnaturally still. If she couldn't get these chains off, it wouldn't survive much longer. Frustration and desperation fueled her next movements. She grabbed the axe, raising it high above her head before swinging it down with all her strength. The blade struck the chain with a loud clang, sending vibrations through her arms. A spark flickered in the icy air. The metal was tough, but it wasn't indestructible. Again she lifted the axe and brought it down again. Her muscles burned. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. With one final, forceful blow, the chain cracked. A rush of adrenaline shot through her as she grabbed at the broken links, pulling them away from the bear's body. The moment the last piece fell, the bear shuddered violently, as if suddenly aware of its freedom. Its limbs twitched, but it remained weak, unable to stand. Alara acted fast. She pulled her jacket tighter around its frozen body, using her own body heat to help warm it. It needed shelter immediately. She couldn't carry it, but she could try to help it move. With gentle hands, she nudged the bear, whispering words of encouragement, even though she knew it wouldn't understand. At first, it didn't react, but then, slowly, its large, heavy head lifted just a fraction. Its glassy eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Something desperate. "You have to try," she murmured, though her own voice was barely audible against the howling wind. Then, to her amazement, the bear shifted. Its limbs trembled as it tried to push itself up, weak, but alive. Alara's chest tightened with emotion. It wasn't giving up. Neither was she. As the bear struggled to move, she reached down, gripping it beneath its thick, frozen fur, helping to support its weight. It was slow, painfully slow, but they had no choice. They needed to get out of this forest. But as Alara turned, ready to lead the bear toward her cabin, she noticed something in the distance. A shadow standing at the tree line, watching them. She wasn't alone. Alara's body went rigid. The figure stood just beyond the reach of the swirling snow, half obscured by the thick trunks of the trees. Though the storm blurred the edges of everything, she could make out the shape. A person, silent, unmoving, watching. Her grip on the axe tightened instinctively. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm. Running wouldn't help. Whoever this was, they had been here before. They had left the bear to die, and now they had come back. She took a slow step forward, positioning herself between the bear and the figure. The wind howled through the trees, lifting loose snowflakes into a swirling frenzy, but the person didn't move. No call, no sound, just eerie stillness. 1,000 thoughts rushed through Alara's mind. Should she yell, demand to know who they were? But what if they didn't answer? What if they did? What if they weren't alone? The bear groaned behind her, shifting its weight but still too weak to stand fully. It needed time, they both did. Then the figure moved. Not toward her, not away, but slightly to the side, circling slowly, deliberately. Alara's heart slammed against her ribs. Whoever they weren't lost. They weren't just another hiker caught in the storm. They were here with purpose. She knew fear when she saw it, and this wasn't fear. This was control. The bear let out a weak, rumbling sound, somewhere between a groan and a growl, as if sensing the tension. Alara took a deep breath, fighting the cold biting at her skin and the panic clawing at her mind. She had to think. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figure stepped back into the woods, disappearing into the storm. Alara stood frozen, staring at the spot where they had been. Had they truly left, or were they still out there, hidden, waiting? She didn't have time to find out. Spinning around, she crouched beside the bear. "Come on," she whispered urgently, tugging at its thick fur. "We have to go." The bear, though weak, seemed to understand. It made another strained effort to rise, its large paws sinking into the snow as it wobbled unsteadily. Elara reached for its side, doing what little she could to steady it. Step by step, they moved forward. The trek was painfully slow, each movement an exhausting effort against the relentless cold. Elara kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see the shadow return, expecting to hear footsteps crunching in the snow. But the forest remained eerily silent. Still, she knew better than to trust it. After what felt like an eternity, the outline of her cabin came into view through the storm. Relief surged through her, but she didn't let herself slow down. She half-guided, half-dragged the bear toward the entrance, shoving the door open with her shoulder and pulling the animal inside. The warmth of the small cabin was an instant shock after the brutal cold. Elara wasted no time. She shoved the door shut, locking it behind her before dropping the axe to the floor. The bear collapsed onto the wooden boards, its heavy breathing filling the space. Elara rushed to the fireplace, fumbling with the frozen logs stacked beside it. Her fingers barely worked, stiff from the frostbite settling in. She struck a match, her hand shaking, and lit the fire. The flames crackled to life, their glow casting flickering shadows against the walls. She turned back to the bear. Its eyes remained open but glassy, its exhaustion overwhelming. She knelt beside it, brushing away the remaining frost from its fur. "You made it," she murmured, not even sure if she was speaking to the bear or herself. But the sense of safety was fleeting. A sound echoed from outside, a soft crunch. Footsteps. Elara's breath hitched. Slowly, she stood, her heart thumping against her ribs. She crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered through the frost-covered glass. At first, she saw nothing, just trees, snow, and darkness. But then, movement. A shadow shifting near the tree line, watching, waiting. Whoever had been out there hadn't left after all. They had followed her. Elara's pulse hammered in her ears as she stood frozen by the window. The shadowy figure was still there, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. Whoever they were, they weren't leaving. They were waiting, watching. Her breath came out in ragged puffs as she forced herself to think. She had made it this far, but she wasn't safe yet. The bear, barely hanging on, was sprawled beside the fire, too weak to defend itself. And now someone was outside. Someone who had tied the bear to that tree, left it to die, and was now following her. Elara backed away from the window, moving toward the axe she had dropped. She gripped the handle tightly, the rough wood grounding her. If they tried to come inside, she would be ready. Then another sound, closer this time, a slow, deliberate footstep on the porch. Her stomach twisted. They were right outside. The bear let out a weak, rumbling breath, shifting slightly, but it was still too drained to move. Elara pressed herself against the cabin wall, every muscle in her body coiled with tension. She listened, her breath shallow, waiting for the next sound. Silence. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. Elara's grip on the axe tightened. A knock that was almost worse than if they had tried to break in. It meant they wanted her to know they were there. Her mind raced. Should she answer? Call out? Stay silent? The storm outside roared, shaking the cabin walls, but beyond it, she heard something even more chilling. A voice, low, quiet, barely audible through the door. "You shouldn't have done that." Elara's blood ran cold. The voice was hoarse, as if unused for a long time, male, gruff. There was no anger in it, no urgency, just a simple, matter-of-fact statement. She didn't respond. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then footsteps again, slowly retreating, fading into the storm. Elara waited, barely breathing, straining to hear. Had they left? Or were they just trying to make her think they had? Minutes passed. The only sounds were the howling wind and the crackling fire. Still, she didn't relax. She couldn't. She turned to the bear. His breathing was slow but steady. They had to get out of here. Staying meant being trapped if that man, whoever he was, decided to return. She had no way to stop him. But how could she move a weak, nearly frozen bear? She glanced around the cabin, her mind racing. Then she spotted an old sled leaning against the far wall. It was small, built for hauling supplies, but if she could somehow get the bear onto it. Without wasting another second, she grabbed the sled and dragged it toward the fireplace. The bear stirred slightly as she knelt beside it. "I need you to help me," she murmured, knowing it couldn't understand but saying it anyway. "Just a little more." She gently grasped its thick fur and tried to lift, but the bear was heavy, its body dead weight. Gritting her teeth, she used all her strength, shifting it inch by inch onto the sled. It let out a weak groan but didn't fight her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear was positioned on the sled, wrapped in every piece of fabric she could find to keep it warm. Alara grabbed the rope and stood, taking a deep breath. This was going to be brutal. The snow was deep, the wind merciless, but she had no choice. She cracked open the door, peering into the storm. The figure was gone, at least for now. She stepped out, dragging the sled behind her. The cold slammed into her, cutting through her layers, but she pressed on, one step at a time. The nearest town was miles away, but there was an old ranger station a couple of miles north. If she could make it there, she could find help. The forest loomed around her, the wind howling through the trees. Every few steps, she looked over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadow return. But all she saw was swirling snow and darkness. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She pulled the sled harder, pushing through the exhaustion. The bear made a faint noise. Still alive, still holding on. She had to keep going, for both of them. Alara's arms burned with exhaustion, but she refused to stop. The snow was deep, making every step a battle against the freezing wind. The sled's runners barely glided over the thick powder, forcing her to pull with every ounce of strength she had left. The bear lay motionless, wrapped in layers of fabric, its breathing slow but steady. The ranger station had to be close now. She kept telling herself that, using it as motivation to keep moving. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see that shadowy figure lurking in the trees. But the forest remained eerily still, save for the storm that roared around her. Then, finally, a shape emerged through the blinding snow. The ranger station. Relief nearly buckled her knees, but she forced herself to push forward. The small wooden structure was old but sturdy, its roof weighed down by layers of snow. She stumbled up the steps and reached for the handle, praying it wasn't locked. The door creaked open. Alara wasted no time. She pulled the sled inside, dragging the bear into the relative warmth of the cabin before kicking the door shut behind her. The wind still howled outside, rattling the wooden walls, but at least they were sheltered now. The cabin was sparse, nothing more than a single room with a small wood stove, a table, and a metal frame cot. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of old wood and stale air. But none of that mattered. They had made it. She turned to the bear. It lay still on the sled, its fur crusted with ice, its breath shallow. It needed warmth, fast. Alara hurried to the stove, fumbling with the latch until it creaked open. A few logs sat in a pile beside it, dry enough to burn. With stiff, frozen fingers, she reached for the matches on the table and struck one. The small flame flickered to life, and she carefully lit the kindling inside the stove. The fire caught quickly, glowing embers spreading into full flames. The warmth radiated outward, chasing away the bitter cold that had seeped into her bones. She turned back to the bear. Its body still looked lifeless, but when she knelt beside it, she noticed its breathing had grown stronger. Still faint, but steadier than before. That was a good sign. Alara carefully removed the layers of fabric she had wrapped around it, exposing its thick fur to the warmth. She ran her hands over its body, checking for injuries. Its limbs were stiff, its paws raw from the cold, but there were no visible wounds apart from where the chains had cut into its flesh. As the fire grew, she noticed a change. The bear's breathing deepened, its sides rising and falling more naturally. Then, slowly, its large head shifted slightly. Her heart leaped. It was coming back. Alara moved cautiously, not wanting to startle the animal. Though weak, it was still a bear. If it suddenly panicked, she had nowhere to run. Minutes passed in silence, save for the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. Then, for the first time, the bear's eyes opened fully, dark, glossy, alive. Alara exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "You're okay," she whispered, even though she knew the bear couldn't understand her. The bear blinked slowly, its gaze flickering between her and the fire. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply watched her. She didn't dare get too close, but she stayed nearby, letting the warmth do its work. Hours passed. The storm outside raged on, snow piling against the windows, but inside, the cabin was safe. The fire burned strong, filling the room with comforting heat. Alara sat on the floor, exhaustion pulling at her, but she refused to sleep. She kept watch over the bear, knowing that even though they had escaped the immediate danger, they weren't safe yet. Somewhere out there, in the endless white of the forest, that man was still lurking, and she had no doubt he would come back. Alara sat with her back against the cold wooden wall, her legs pulled close to her chest as she watched the bear. The fire crackled in the stove, casting flickering shadows across the cabin, but the warmth was doing its job. The bear's breathing had steadied, and its body no longer trembled from the cold. It was still weak, but there was life in its dark eyes now, awareness. She exhaled, rubbing her numb fingers together. The relief was fleeting. The bear had survived the night, but what now? She couldn't keep it here. She wasn't a wildlife expert, and she had no way of knowing if it would even recover fully. She had to get help. The thought filled her with dread. She had no idea if the man who had chained the bear to the tree was still out there. The way he had knocked on the cabin door and whispered those chilling words. She hadn't seen him since, but that didn't mean he was gone. Her only option was to reach the nearest town and find someone who could take the bear in. But leaving meant going back into the storm. She could wait, let the blizzard pass, but she had no way of knowing how long it would last. And every second she stayed here, the greater the risk of that man finding them again. She needed a plan. Alara stood slowly, stretching her stiff muscles before moving toward the small storage area in the corner of the cabin. She rummaged through the dusty shelves, hoping to find anything useful. A few old supplies remained, some canned food, a flashlight with weak batteries, and, to her relief, a two-way radio. Her fingers fumbled as she turned the dial, hoping for a signal. Static filled the room, and she held her breath, adjusting the frequency. Nothing. She bit her lip, trying again. Still nothing but the empty crackle of static. She set the radio down with a frustrated sigh. The storm was too strong. The signal wouldn't go through until it cleared up. The bear let out a low, rumbling sound, shifting slightly on the floor. Alara turned her attention back to it. Though still weak, it was trying to move now, testing its limbs as it adjusted its position closer to the fire. "That's it," she murmured, watching in awe. The bear blinked at her but didn't seem afraid. There was no aggression in its posture, no sign that it saw her as a threat. She wondered if, deep down, it understood that she had saved it. She reached for the can of food she had found and pried it open. It wasn't much, just some old beans, but it was better than nothing. She placed a small portion in front of the bear, uncertain if it would eat. For a long moment the bear didn't move. Then, slowly, it lowered its head and sniffed at the food before lapping at it weakly. Alara let out a shaky breath. It was a good sign. She sat back, watching as the bear continued to eat in slow, careful bites. She knew it needed more, real food, not just scraps, but at least it was regaining some strength. As the hours passed, Alara kept glancing toward the window, her unease growing. The snow had started to let up, but the thick fog of night still clung to the forest. She wasn't sure if it was paranoia or instinct, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her thoughts drifted back to that man. Why had he tied the bear to the tree in the first place? Was it some twisted game, A test of nature's will? She shuddered at the thought. If he had come back once, there was no reason to believe he wouldn't return again. She needed to be ready. Her fingers tightened around the axe beside her. She had already saved the bear's life once. She wouldn't let anyone take it away. The hours dragged on, marked only by the steady crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Alara kept her eyes on the window, her muscles tense despite her exhaustion. She had barely slept, every sound outside sending her heart racing. The bear, however, had drifted into a deep, exhausted slumber, its body curled up near the warmth of the stove. The storm had begun to calm. The snow no longer fell in heavy sheets, though a thick fog still clung to the trees, making visibility poor. Alara knew she couldn't wait much longer. The bear was improving, but it needed real care. She had to get to the nearest town, find a ranger, report what had happened. And yet, she hesitated not because of the storm, not even because of the bear, but because of him. The man who had been outside, the one who had whispered those chilling words, the one who had left the bear to die. Alara didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing. He wasn't done. She stood and moved to the window, careful to keep her body low. The early morning light was beginning to seep through the trees, but the forest remained eerily quiet. She scanned the tree line, her breath shallow. First she saw nothing, then movement, a shadow. Her stomach dropped. He was there, standing at the edge of the forest, partially obscured by the trees, the same figure. He wasn't moving toward the cabin. He was just standing there, watching, waiting. Alara's grip on the axe tightened. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to do something. Run, fight, scream. But she forced herself to stay still, her mind racing. Why wasn't he leaving? What did he want? Then, as if sensing her eyes on him, he took a step forward. Alara's breath hitched. Then another step and another until he stood just beyond the porch. The dim morning light finally illuminated his face. He was older than she had expected, weathered with sharp, sunken features and a thick beard dusted with frost. His clothes were worn, heavy, like someone who had spent years braving the wilderness. But his eyes were the worst part. They weren't wild or angry or even curious. They were calm, too calm, like he already knew how this would end. "You shouldn't have done that," he said again, his voice low, deliberate. Alara forced herself to stand tall, the axe firm in her grip. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question, then let out a slow breath, his gaze shifting toward the bear inside. "That wasn't yours to save." Alara's jaw clenched. "What are you talking about?" The man took another step closer, stopping just at the base of the porch steps. "You think you did a good thing, don't you?" His voice was almost amused. "You have no idea what you've done." Alara felt a wave of anger rise inside her. "I saved that bear's life," she snapped. "Who the hell are you to say otherwise?" The man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," she shot back, refusing to let the fear show. The man's eyes darkened. For the first time, his expression shifted. Not anger, but something else. Resignation. He glanced at the bear once more before speaking. "That bear should have died," he said simply. Alara's stomach twisted. "I tied it there," he continued, his voice steady. "It was weak, too weak to survive the winter. I was doing what nature would have done eventually." Alara's breath caught. "You left it there to die?" The man nodded, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "It wasn't strong enough." Her hands trembled with rage. "You don't get to decide that." The man studied her for a moment. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he stepped back. "You think you helped it," he murmured. "But you don't understand the wild." Alara didn't move as he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the mist. She stood there for a long time, gripping the axe so tightly her knuckles turned white. Only when the forest was completely still again did she allow herself to breathe. She turned back to the bear. It was alive, and that was all that mattered. Alara's pulse slowly steadied as she stood in the doorway, staring into the forest where the man had disappeared. His words still echoed in her mind. That bear should have died. The sheer cruelty of it sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through her. How could anyone believe that life, any life, was something to be discarded just because it wasn't strong enough? She turned back inside, closing the door and locking it behind her. The bear had lifted its head slightly, its dark eyes watching her with quiet awareness. It was still weak, but stronger than before. It had survived, despite everything, and she would make sure it continued to. She needed help. Alara grabbed the radio again, twisting the dial. The storm had lessened now, the sky brightening with the weak morning sun. Maybe she could get a signal. She adjusted the frequency, holding her breath as static crackled through the small speaker. Then, finally, a faint voice. Station 7. Repeat your signal. Over. Relief flooded through her. This is Alara, hiker in the Northern Ridge cabin. I need assistance, over, she said quickly, her voice trembling from exhaustion. A brief pause, then Alara, confirm. What's your emergency? Over. She exhaled sharply. I found a bear tied to a tree. It was left for dead. I freed it, but it's weak. It needs care. Over. Another pause. The line crackled again before the ranger's voice returned. More alert this time. You said it was tied to a tree? Someone did this. Over. Yes, Alara confirmed, glancing at the bear. And whoever did it is still out here. Over. Silence. Then, stay put. We're sending a team. Over. The radio cut out, but Alara clutched it tightly, her body sagging with relief. Help was coming. She turned her attention back to the bear. It was still watching her, its large body curled near the fire. She crouched down, speaking softly. You're going to be okay? She murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure the bear or herself. Minutes turned into an hour, and then, finally, the sound of approaching snowmobiles broke the silence. Alara rushed to the door, stepping outside to see two rangers making their way toward the cabin. One of them, a tall man in a heavy green coat named Torin, approached with urgency. You're Alara? She nodded. Inside. The bear's weak, but it's alive. The rangers exchanged a glance before stepping inside, their eyes widening as they took in the sight of the massive animal curled near the fire. The second ranger, a woman with sharp blue eyes named Sila, let out a low whistle. You weren't kidding, she muttered, setting down a large medical bag. Alara stepped back as the rangers moved in, carefully assessing the bear's condition. Torin crouched down, checking for signs of frostbite and injury. It's underweight but stable. You did a good job keeping it warm. Sila looked up at Alara. Do you know who did this? Alara hesitated. I saw him. He came here last night. He told me he tied the bear up because he thought it was too weak to survive the winter. Torin's jaw tightened. You saw him? She nodded. He was watching me. He knocked on the cabin door, told me I shouldn't have interfered. Sila exchanged another look with her partner. We've had reports of someone trapping animals up here. No one's ever seen him up close until now. Alara swallowed hard. He's dangerous. He'll do it again. Torin stood, his expression grim. We'll track him. But for now, let's get this bear out of here. With practiced movements, the rangers worked together to prepare the bear for transport. Alara helped where she could, gently guiding the sled as they moved the animal outside. The bear, though weak, didn't resist as they secured it onto one of the snowmobiles. Sila turned to Alara. You saved its life. Alara looked at the bear one last time, something tightening in her chest. I just did what anyone would do. The ranger shook her head. Not anyone would have done what you did. Alara didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded as the snowmobiles roared to life, carrying the bear away to safety. She stood in the clearing, watching them disappear into the trees. The forest was quiet again, the storm finally gone, but she knew she would never forget what had happened here. And she knew, deep down, that somewhere in those woods the man was still watching. And she would be ready. As Alara stood in the clearing, watching the rangers disappear into the distance with the bear, A strange sense of peace settled over her. The fight wasn't over. There were still people out there who saw life as disposable, but she had proven that kindness, courage, and determination could make a difference. One life saved, one story changed. If you found the story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more incredible tales of survival, compassion, and the unexpected connections between humans and nature. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.